Well, good morning, everybody. We are still looking at the life of David. We've reached 2 Samuel chapter 2, and the big issue facing David at this part of Samuel is how will he, as God's anointed king, as the rightful king, take the throne in this dangerous power vacuum left by the death of King Saul. It was greatly complicated by the fact that the nation was divided. The tribe of Judah had declared its loyalty to David, but the rest of the tribes had not. Saul's army was still a force to be reckoned with. Abner, its commander-in-chief and Saul's cousin, was still a very powerful, influential figure in the land. And Abner decided that he would throw his weight behind Saul's last remaining son, Ishbosheth, rather than behind David. And so he made Ishbosheth king over Israel, which, of course, if you think about it, is a rather dangerous thing, because the person who makes you king one day can unmake you king the next. So Ishbosheth was in a very vulnerable position indeed. So what we have here then in 2 Samuel 2 is a divided nation, 2 kings, 2 armies, and 2 powerful generals. Joab, who was David's commander-in-chief, and Abner, who was the commander-in-chief of the armies of Israel. And so attention now focuses to these 2 key, powerful, influential figures within the land. What will they do? Well, they agreed to meet, which is, at least, should be a good thing. They met at a pool in chapter 2, which is more likely to be some kind of water shaft. And Abner, well, he sat down with his men on one side, and Joab sat down with his on the other. And the question is, what would they talk about? Perhaps they should talk about how they would unite the nation under God's chosen king, healing wounds, avoiding civil war, ensuring peace. But sadly, no. Abner proposed something else. In verse 14 of chapter 2, Abner said to Joab, "Let's have some of the young men get up and fight hand to hand in front of us." And the word literally translated is play. So let's get some of our young men up in front of us and play. It's the word also used for amusement. In other words, what happened next was an amusement put on for these powerful generals because Joab agreed to it. It was a competition for glory, for bragging rights. So each chose 12 of their best young men to play against the other team. Team Ishbosheth, Benjamin and Israel on one side, and Team Judah under Joab on the other. But of course, this wasn't an early game of football with too many players. It wasn't play, it was actually war games. And what happened was 24 young men in the prime of life, equally matched in skill and strength, fought out this game until none was left alive. Young men wiped out to satisfy the desires of their generals for amusement and competition and the glory of winning. How often it has happened. This is Remembrance Sunday. Innocent lives sacrificed. Not always in the cause of justice, but in war games put on to satisfy the lust of a few individuals for glory, for bragging rights, power, and wealth. It's a sobering introduction to the task facing David. And war games have a habit of escalating into all-out battle, which is what happens here. with Joab's men prevailing. And one of Joab's brothers, there were three of them, very powerful, strong, brilliant fighters. But the younger one was a young man named Asahel. And perhaps emboldened by the fact that his side was really prevailing in this, which has now turned into a battle, a war, he took matters too far and decided that he would go after the enemy's general. He was a superb athlete. He ran like a gazelle, the text tells us. And he relentlessly pursued Abner. Abner tried to call him off, go after somebody else, because Abner had absolutely no desire to kill the man who was Joab's younger brother. But the young man wouldn't back down. He wouldn't desist. He kept after him. And Abner, in the end, had no choice. He was a skilled, older, wily warrior. He reversed his spear as he ran, kept it hidden from the young man, waited until he had nearly caught up with him, and thrust backwards. Whoops. And he was killed outright. Joab, enraged that Abner had killed his brother, escalated matters. And he and his remaining brother with their men chased Abner and their men until sunset. It was no longer a game, it was war against fellow Israelites. It was a civil war. It was brother against brother, family against family. And eventually, Abner gathered his men on the top of a hill and called out to Joab, "Must the sword devour forever? Don't you realize that this will end in bitterness? How long before you order your men to stop pursuing your fellow Israelites?" And Joab, at Abner's speech, called off the fighting. But for him, the game was not over. He had lost his brother, he blamed Abner, and that went deep down, as we shall see in a moment. But listen to the words again. Don't you realize this will end in bitterness? Let the story, let the words echo their warning in our minds. The bitterness that results from so-called fun, so-called friendly rivalry, banter, war games. How easy things can escalate to the point where it is hard to know who started what, and it turns into an endless tit-for-tat cycle of hatred, anger, revenge, and the destruction of individual lives. We've seen it in our country, a nation fighting itself, pulling itself apart. We've seen it in the business world. We've seen it in families. We've seen it in churches. What bitterness it produces. And perhaps the lesson from this, in terms of those who are in positions of power and leadership, is this: leadership is not a game. People's lives are at stake. Leadership is not about personal slights, personal agendas, revenge. It's not a competition. It's not about winning. It's about loyalty to Jesus as Lord. It's about caring for those he entrusts to us. It's about sharing the good news with the world. But how many churches have been torn apart through, for example, strong personalities insisting on having their way, whatever the damage is done? How many are damaged by unedifying theological games, or by church leaders whose ambition is to make a name for themselves? I've lived through that a couple of times. And from being a safe place, church turns into a field of daggers, which is what this ancient playground battleground came to be called a field of daggers, leaving many embittered people, many people indeed who walk away from the Christian faith altogether. If this is how Christians behave, I don't want anything to do with Christianity. Let's be very, very careful. We're dealing with the precious, valuable lives of individual people. Now, this game was way outside of David's knowledge and clearly without his approval. His intention was not civil war, but patiently to wait God's timing to seek to win over Abner and Israel to his cause as the rightful king. And as he waited, the house of David became stronger, the text tells us, whereas the house of Saul with Ishbosheth as king became weaker. And at the same time, though, Abner, commander-in-chief of Israel, was becoming more and more powerful. King Ishbosheth, no doubt feeling the pressure of being totally in Abner's power, accused Abner of impropriety over one of Saul's concubines. Now, I'm not going to get into this, the way society was organized, etc. You can read that up for yourself. But this was a serious charge. And there's no indication in the text either of his guilt or his innocence. But what happened was this was the last straw for Abner. He had had enough of being the general to a puppet king. And he decided that the time had come for him to bring the nation under David. The nation certainly could not be led by King Ishbosheth. So he sent a message to David. Whose land is it? Make an agreement with me, and I will help you bring all Israel over to you. David sent this reply. Good. I will make an agreement with you, but I demand one thing of you. Do not come into my presence unless you bring Michal, daughter of Saul, when you come to see me. That's Michal with an A-L at the end, for those of you who are interested. Michal, if you know the backstory, was David's rightful wife. He had won her at great personal cost and personal risk. But Saul then had cheated David and given Michal to another. So David was sending a clear message to Abner. Abner would not make David king the way he'd made Ishbosheth king. For if he made David king, he could unmake him again. Abner knew that David was God's anointed. He also knew that Saul's daughter was David's legitimate wife. Abner must now put right the wrong that Saul had done. There would be no negotiation until he brought Michal to David, and thus acknowledging that David indeed was Saul's son-in-law and was, in fact, in that way also rightful heir to the throne, because Ishbosheth was no longer fit to rule. Now the story develops, and it's quite sad in a way. We can't help feeling sorry for the man to whom Michal had been wrongfully married. He clearly loved her. He followed her the whole way until Abner turned round and told the poor man with cold finality to go home. And he went home. Abner kept his word. He met with David, restored Michal to him, brought all the remaining tribes over to David as king. He had a great banquet. And Abner, says the text, went home in peace. But when Joab, David's commander-in-chief, heard what had happened, that David had met with Abner, that had gone well, he was not at peace. And so he called Abner in for a private meeting with him and his brother and assassinated the unsuspecting Abner in cold blood. Why did he do it? According to the text, it was because of his brother that Abner had killed. But was it just to assassinate Abner? Exact revenge this way? Was it even revenge? Certainly, was it justice? Or Was Joab a little bit concerned that David might actually appoint Abner, who had shown such great statesmanship, to a new position of commander-in-chief over all the armies of Israel? David didn't consider Abner's killing as justice. And he made his abhorrence at what Joab had done very clear and very public. First of all, through a strong public statement, may Abner's blood be on Joab's head. In other words, this isn't justice. Then he forced Joab to wear mourning and head Abner's funeral procession. And then he himself publicly wept at Abner's funeral, as did all the people. He then composed and sang a song of lament over Abner, making his view of the killing as evil unmistakable. He refused to eat for the remainder of the day, and when his entourage tried to encourage him to eat, he said this: "Do you not realize that a commander and a great man has fallen in Israel this day? And today, though I am the anointed king, I am weak. And these sons of Zeruiah," that is Joab and his brother, "are too strong for me. May the Lord repay the evildoer according to his evil deeds." Such detail. I've just told you, I condensed the story down because it's too long for us to read. But such detail. Why does the text give us so much detail? This was a hugely difficult moment for David to navigate and demonstrate kingship. Leadership is not easy at any level. There's so many different agendas and personalities. To do what is right and to do what is wise is often a very complex thing. His aim was to unite the nation in peace under his leadership. Abner was a hugely popular leader in Israel, had been won over to the cause, but now Joab had put the unity and peace of the nation at severe risk. David was not in a strong position politically or militarily to remove Joab, which he admitted, as we've just heard. Everyone could see it. It takes something, though, for a leader to admit their weakness and vulnerability in public. What attitude would the people take? Would the nation rebel against David because of what Joab had done? No. They could see that David had acted well, the text tells us. Everyone could see that he had had no part in the killing of Abner. But there's a deeper question, which I want to finish with this morning. What is the value of human life when it comes to leadership? You see, what the text does is it shows us how seriously David took the injustice that had happened to Abner, and how deeply moved he was. We will probably have to come to our own conclusion as to why David never moved to bring justice on Joab. But when David was dying, he left instructions for his successor, Solomon. First thing you do is deal with Joab. Why? This is what he said. Because Joab shed the blood of war in peace. Abner had killed Joab's brother in open war. According to the rules of war, Joab was not justified in seeking revenge. Abner's death was an unjustified killing, the shedding of innocent blood. As I say, so much detail. And when you stand back from it, I think we begin to realize just how important these issues are. Issues of justice, issues of the value of the individual human life. And that comes out again in chapter 4, where attention turns to Ishbosheth, the former puppet king. His is a sad story of a weak man caught up in power politics beyond his understanding or control. And he gradually lost whatever courage he had and stayed at home more and more, when he should have been providing leadership, helping Israel acknowledge David as the rightful king, and so on. And one day, he was having his siesta when two of his young lieutenants paid him a visit and killed him in his bed. Fed up with his pathetic approach. And they brought the grisly evidence of their slaying of Ishbosheth to David. And this is what they said. Listen. This day, the Lord has avenged my lord the king against Saul and his offspring. They obviously thought that this is what God wanted and that David would be pleased by this demonstration of loyalty to him, and they were in for the shock of their lives. Listen to David's reply. As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble. When someone told me Saul is dead and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and put him to death in Ziklag. That was the reward I gave him for his news. How much more when wicked men have killed an innocent man in his own house and on his own bed, should I not now demand his blood from your hand and rid the earth of you? Just because leaders use God talk doesn't mean that God has anything to do with their actions. This was sheer wickedness. They had shed innocent blood, not in war, but in the man's own home, in his own bed, and David had the men executed for their treachery. He wasn't going to rule as king on the back of such evil. See, one of the things we need to know of any king, of any government, of any leader, is the value they place on the lives of those they govern. We measure the character of a government, of a leader, by their attitude towards the value of human life, especially the most vulnerable, and not just in government. I remember as a student grappling with competing worldviews that were clamoring for my allegiance, a wise professor suggested a question I should ask of any philosophy or social scheme or scientific or psychological theory of life or alternative religion. Here was the question: what is the true value of a human being according to this scheme, according to this philosophy, according to this religion? These days, through the media, everywhere is pumped out the philosophy of secular materialism as a religion. You'll hear it in just about every program in the classroom in school, especially in our universities. Ask the question, what is the value of a human being under this philosophy? And the answer is, as I discovered way back in my early 20s, none. The universe doesn't even know that I exist. One day it will erase me without trace and won't even know it has done it. I exist in a space between two nothings. I am a blob of organized mud. Take it to its conclusion. Pare away the propaganda, the myths, and get to the heart of it. But can you imagine the effect on a population, on generations of young people and students who are fed this stuff that is ultimately telling them that they have no value? Is it any wonder people start believing it and begin to think that they don't count? They have absolutely no value. Thankfully, most people who say they believe this stuff don't actually live it out in practice. but you've got to push it to its limit. What about genuine Christianity? And I need to wrap this up because time is racing by. Early in the Gospels, we read of King Herod. What was his attitude to human life? Well, when he heard that there was one born king of the Jews in Bethlehem, he had all male children under the age of 2 killed. Matthew later tells us of another King Herod who was living in an immoral relationship with his brother's wife. When John the Baptist confronted him about his immorality, he threw John the Baptist in prison. But because of a foolish promise he then made, when he was drunk and seduced by a provocative sensual dance his wife's daughter performed for him, he had John the Baptist executed. He hadn't intended to kill him, of course, just shut him up, but he was caught by his public promise. And in the end, what did one more life matter? What did those babies in Bethlehem, what did their lives matter? So they couldn't even fend for themselves. Sound familiar? What about the spiritual leaders of the day? What was their attitude to the value of human life? Well, they paid Judas to betray Jesus to them. And when Judas fully realized what he had done, he came back to them in complete panic and said, listen, I have betrayed the blood of an innocent man. What was their response as the great spiritual leaders? What is that to us? You say it to it. In other words, we don't care. It's not our job. But it was their job under the law. It was specifically the job of the priests to prevent the shedding of innocent blood in the nation. What about the Roman leadership? The case of Jesus was brought before Pilate, and upon examining the evidence, he could see that Jesus was innocent. He knew he should release him. But when he saw the Jewish leaders and the mob howling for his blood, he sent for a bowl of water and washed his hands in public, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it. It was his job as governor to judge in matters of life and death. Instead, he handed Jesus over to the mob. What about Jesus? On the night in which he was betrayed, he took bread and wine. And when he took the cup of wine, he said to his disciples, this is my blood, which is shed for you. Jesus also shed innocent blood, but not the blood of his subjects. He shed his own innocent blood. Here is the true king who values his subjects so much that he lays down his life for them. Does your philosophical system, your alternate religion, give you a value like this? What is the value of a human life? In the end, it can't rely on just personal taste. Like, I like ice cream, but I don't like chocolate. I like this person, I don't like that. Human value can't reside in that. Human value can't reside in some utilitarian consideration. You're valuable because you're useful. You're valuable because you are good looking. You're valuable because you contribute to society. In the end, human beings, to be valuable, must have an intrinsic value, and I know nothing else that can give that value except the understanding that we have been created not by the universe, not by ourselves, but by God, and not just that, we have been created in his image. But Christianity goes further. It says you are valuable as a human being because God himself became one and laid down his life for you. As I finish, there is a massive challenge here. For those of us especially who are grandparents and parents, to communicate this sense of value to our children. Because they're not going to get it anywhere else. They're not going to hear this message anywhere else. They're going to hear some soft-spoken humanism that is deceptive in the end, gives no value to a human being. It is a hopeless worldview, literally hopeless. And instead of sitting passively back and letting other people educate our children in the philosophy and religions of our age, we need to play a part in teaching our kids why human life matters, why their life matters. Not just because we love them, but because every human being is created in the image of God, and God so loved the world that he gave his Son, that whoever believed in him would not perish, but have eternal life. Jesus came into the world to bring many sons to glory. There is no other message like this. So can I encourage you? Get with what's going on. Listen carefully. Pick up the messages from your young people. Listen. Spend the time yourself trying to understand. Develop your own understanding so that you can help to give them the skills as well as the emotional support to take them through the competing challenges. And that may mean that you need to do a little bit of work. You might need to get a hold of something like this, doing what's right, about ethics, about decision making. Are you concerned about abortion? Are you concerned about euthanasia? Are you concerned about racism and all these other things that are so much in the zeitgeist of our day? Here's a brilliant book. I just bought it this week and started to read it. I'd forgotten it existed. It's superb. It's like a course for parents and how to think these things through, and then how to help their kids think them through. Doing what's right. David Gooding, John Lennox. You can see I'm biased. My big brother. But we've got to engage with this and not just close our minds and bury our head in the sand of the world that we live in, so that our kids grow up strong with a sense not only of their own personal worth, that's not based on mantras like, you're worth it, but something more profound, but the worth of every other human being. Whatever their color, whatever their ability or disability, whatever their age, that every other human being is valuable, created in the image of God. Father, we pray that the stark message of this passage will hit home to us again. The awful war games that are played, the terrible excesses of foolish leadership that can so easily damage others, whether it's in our family, in our business, in government, in the church. Lord, preserve us. May we understand the heart of Jesus and seek to live like him, laying down our lives for one another and not laying down one another's lives for ourselves. Teach us, we pray, and help us face the challenge of a world that is increasingly in rebellion against its Creator. That at least we, in our own family, in our own circle of influence, can live out and share the true value and dignity that you confer on every human being. In Jesus' name.